I set this up, I don't know, back in the fall, I guess, thinking, oh, this would be a good topic. And so I've continued to think that as well. But, it's kind of like, what are we going to do with this? And the title, Minding the Gap, I started thinking about that just in terms of that, saying that people have about, think about Jesus and who Jesus is, and think about you and who you are, and like pay attention to that gap, and then, pray for God's grace, for the fact that there is a gap. But then I started thinking about, in our society today, we have this this kind of dilemma, right? We've siloed religion into sort of this kind of relatively private sphere, or we've politicized religion so that it has become something of a truncheon by which we hit people over the head with, or something like that. And then we've got this sort of academic enterprise that all of us are engaged in, where that's been secularized over the past century or so, because 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, people were really not worried so much about, how do you integrate faith and what we do in the academic enterprise. The idea that, God is the author of the universe, and therefore all the laws and all the things that we discover in the universe are just, a manifestation of God's wisdom and life. That was just sort of, everybody bought into that. Now, everybody doesn't buy into that. Okay? So we have this then special mission. There we go. So we have a special mission at SNU, and we know this mission, and this is something that the board came up with or developed in 2015, and it has caused a number of faculty members that I know to say, what do I do with this? Okay, so making Christ-like disciples through higher education and a Christ-centered community. What do I do with this? Because I'm a scholar, because I do education. How do I make disciples? Does this mean that in my classroom I'm supposed to, I don't know, give altar calls, or what am I supposed to do with this? Okay, and so I started thinking about that. I started thinking about that a little bit because it didn't seem that peculiar to me. I started thinking, well, so what are we going to do? So I started focusing on this notion of Christ-like disciple. And then I started thinking about, well, what does that mean? Okay, so I want to focus on that, on two of these terms here. The first term I want to focus on is the term disciple, and I want to sort of link it to the idea of discipline. Okay, now I had a sort of an interesting experience. I like to think in terms of analogy. Okay, so I had this interesting experience 15 years ago. We had a faculty member here named Creighton Moss. Creighton taught karate. Okay, so he sort of enticed me into coming and taking karate. And so I would show up, at first it started out with, well, bring your daughters and I'll teach them karate, because he was doing karate for school for children and all this kind of stuff. Well, that might be kind of fun. So me and my daughters show up, and they lasted about 3 weeks, and then I stayed in for a couple of years. Okay. And so I was learning karate. And it was interesting, right? Because karate is this, physical activity that takes you from point A, which is nowhere, to this really high level of mastery if you're willing to stay in it long enough. Okay? And there are these particular ways that you go about learning karate, and they're called katas. Okay? There's these sort of physical moves that you do repeatedly, and you learn how to, move your body in the right kinds of ways to defend yourself, or to incapacitate someone, or to whatever. Okay? And of course, karate is a martial art, so it's a fighting thing. But in Okinawa, as I learned, it was illegal for people to carry weapons, and it was illegal for the common person to train to be a soldier. And so they disguised much of what karate practice was in dance. Okay, so these katas are these sort of fluid, sort of almost dances that you do in order to learn these particular kinds of skills. In the process of doing these dances, in the process of doing these practices through time, one disciplines oneself to particular kinds of behavior, converts particular physical kinds of movements into muscle memory, so it becomes just kind of a response that one does. And also through those practices, through that physical activity, one begins to shape one's understanding or perspective on the world. One begins to understand, like, if this happens, this is my natural response to it. Okay, that's a kind of discipline. Well, we talk about our disciplines in academic terms too, right? Your field of study, we oftentimes call a discipline. Well, why do we call it that? Anybody want to take a stab? Why do we call it a discipline?
So we trained ourselves to look at the world through that
Mm-hmm.
particular aspect or
Mhm.
perspective.
Right, so we've trained ourselves to look at the world through a particular lens, and that lens shapes the way we see the world, right? Colors the way we see the world. So it's a kind of training. How did you train yourself to think like a kinesiologist, or as a theologian, or as an educator, or as a communicator? How did you train yourself to do that?
Practice and practice.
Practice and practice. You read a lot about it? You did. But what you also did?
Did it.
Did
Did
it,
it.
right? Acted on it. Uh-huh. And so part of disciplining oneself is acting. But, question, can you just go and do stuff and expect to improve?
Not always.
Not always. What do you need?
Feedback.
Feedback. Yeah, you need
Reflection.
feedback, reflection, exactly. So that's part of discipline, right? When we use that word discipline, what do we also think about?
Correction.
Correction. Mhm. Yeah, correction. You think about your parents doing what?
Whopping the snot out.
Yeah, your parents disciplined you, and they did it in various ways, right? Sheila and my parents, they took us out in the back and, took the belt out and put the wallop on, right? And other people give verbal correction, right? Tell people what they've done wrong. Or maybe they take a more positive approach and praise what someone did right, and hope to use that to encourage, repeated behavior. All of these kinds of things are disciplining kinds of behaviors. Okay, so that's something that we want to pay attention to. So here's a question with regard to discipline. What does being insert your field of study here, okay? What does being a missiologist, thank you. What does being a theologian, what does being an educator, what does being a kinesiologist, what does being define yourself, Tamara? Business person. Businessologist.
That's it right there. That's the term. I like that one.
Yeah. What does that look like? So what I want you to do is I want you to think about that for a minute. I want you to, if you've got that little sheet of paper, or you can pass it down to your neighbor, I want you to scratch down what you think that is. Then I want you to pair up with somebody, share that for just a minute. Okay. I'm going to do a little interactive activity. Come on up front if you'd like to, man. What are the habits? What are the behaviors? What are the ways of thinking associated with your field? Okay, now pair with someone and tell each other.
I'll come over to you.
Or somewhere up this somewhere. Like most of my students, I have some tutors. Or talk about
What is your opinion on this?
They are the same, with a different.
Oh, okay. Libraries.
We're reflecting.
Yeah.
Here.
No, that would be
Reversing it and doing it.
But
And
still,
the ideas of our.
so you have understanding that there is principles and relating
And I'm assuming Christian
in your,
which is.
And yours.
Yeah, but
It's almost a stereotype.
Yeah.
how we can push this to do that.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. You know, I think the wall was,
And then we get it started.
And that's probably how they interact with each other, so they never felt the need to keep it.
But also had a great.
Right.
All right, let's come back together. Somebody share out what they learned about the person they talked to.
Harlan and I, our disciplines, as he pointed out, I mean, they're very similar with just a different focus.
Okay.
Sport management, that type of thing related to business. So we had a lot of the same things
Okay.
written down.
So what are some of those things?
focusing on world trends and just what's the markets are doing, which way the markets are going, being analytical in the way we approach things.
Able to change quickly with the changing markets. It's adaptable.
All right. What about over here, Jocelyn and Rachel?
Well, Rachel was talking about how she has to stay up to date on technology as a computer technologist.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Okay, and so how technology is always changing, and so she needs to be aware of how technology is advancing.
And Jocelyn is a neurologist. She's always needing to stay up with regulations, and so there's this constant learning that happens for both of us, that we have to, not just our students, but we also have to be continually learning, because our field changes. We have to adapt with that. But she's also having to be not just, she has to be an emotional support as well to her students, and learning to navigate that as well.
Okay, good insight there. Now, next question. Okay, what does being Christ-like look like? So you thought about what it looks like to be a practitioner of your discipline. Now, and I'm not talking about you necessarily, right? But just when you think of that term, Christ-like, so you might be thinking about, Jesus as you know about Jesus in the scripture. You might be thinking about how you were taught about Jesus or all these kinds of things. What does being Christ-like look like? Write it down a little bit on your piece of paper, and then we'll do a think, pair, share on this. Absolutely.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
This is interesting to observe, because when you were writing about what does in your field look like, people were scribbling madly. And what does Christ-like look like? People got 2 or 3 terms there, and they're kind of like pondering that. So that's kind of just an interesting observation to make. Okay, why don't you pair up and share? What's being Christ-like look like?
I think the reason why I was. Right.
I just filled out this question. Basically, what I was talking
Agenda is for your has interactions. That's correct. Well, for me, I
When you're giving it to
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, just point out.
Well, yeah.
What was I like when I was 18, you know, and I was in useless, but I was just, what else was going on that community and everything? Do something else values, something.
You're good. All right, well, let's come back together.
You know, because the way,
Share out.
kindness in general. I think
We'll share out.
Okay.
Well, I'm volunteering Laura. I'll share out. So what Laura talked about were things like perfection, doing the right thing, helping others in need. And what I told her I thought was really interesting is that the things that she talked about from her discipline were things like following the rules, being professional. And so it seems like the things she values in her discipline are also the things she values about Christ, which I thought was kind of an interesting parallel.
And I told her she's in the wrong profession. She's making that. That's like a motivational speech.
Yeah, so I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Who else? What you got?
Well, you know, in talking with Sheila, who is in communications, and I'm in nursing, there are so many things that are so very similar in how we deal with people. But, you know, compassion was something that was the first thing we thought about, and, you know, being genuine, passionate, about what we do because Christ was very passionate, being forgiving, what's another one? Accepting of others. She felt like non-judgmental because he would always have us turn and cheek, when people were not so nice, but being very loving and accepting.
That's good. Others.
And we talked about the fruits of the Spirit and Micah 6:8, and loving mercy, acting justly, and walking humbly. And also just, our students will know that we are Christians by our love. And I would say, maybe not 100% of my students, but most of my students, they know that they can come to me. They know that I'm available. They know that I love them. I really do love them. I don't always like them, but I love them. And they know that they can come to me for anything.
Yeah.
And I think so often, like, if we don't make ourselves available, that reflects poorly of who we are as Christians. And also in the way that we offer feedback. I mean, the church is all about edification and building people up. And so how we provide our criticisms need to be constructive criticisms. We need to be positive and loving in the way that we correct our students so that they know, okay, you're wrong, but we love you and we're trying to help you grow through this and to be better.
Okay. Anyone else?
We all listened to Don because he had really good things.
He's dropping on our He commanded you.
It's already been said.
All right. Well, so we've got Christ likeness, right? And we've got what you do in your discipline. And, Kim already kind of brought up that sometimes those things can overlap, right? And Sheila and Elaine, their disciplines, they already have this sort of sense of, this is the characteristics of Jesus over here. This is what we do in our discipline. We already can see a bit of that overlap, and which I would expect in a place like this, right? We would expect that to be happening. Question becomes, is it happening unintentionally? Just because we're Christian people and we happen to be serving in these teaching roles or whatever roles we're serving in, and those things just kind of are part of us and just kind of overlap, or are we doing things intentionally that help us deepen our integration of faith and learning? Okay, so in the faith and learning integration conversation, the big intellectual conversation around this, one of the things that is has been a part of it is that Calvinist theologians have been pretty influential in the faith and learning integration conversation. Okay, and so it's been a pretty intellectual game in many ways. Wesleyans have been a little slower to develop that sort of faith and learning integration language and sort of build it in. And I think part of that might be because of our more experiential, more intuitive kind of approach to God and understanding God. And so our Wesleyan quadrilateral, that sort of structure that we use to understand how one finds truth, includes things like, the Bible. Okay, what does the Bible say about a particular issue? It includes what does our experience say about what might be true in a particular circumstance. It includes what have others through time said about this particular issue, tradition, and it asks what reason has to say about this. Does it make sense? Is it logical? I mean, can you demonstrate that it works? And it creates a web so that we can capture elements of truth through this sort of web of various different ways of knowing. Okay, so it's not just purely an intellectual game. It's a game that is experiential as well as intellectual. It's a game of experiencing God and then trying to make sense of that experience. Okay, so that's where we work. Question becomes, can we find in daily life the overlap between our academic disciplines and our spiritual disciplines in terms of the way we think about the world. How does the world work? Okay? How does the world work? Your academic discipline tells you something about that. When you're in business, right, the way the world works, the things that you focus on relate to people's economic interactions and how to take advantage of those economic interactions for yourself, okay, or for the people that you work for, whatever that might be. In nursing, you walk into that patient's room and there's a checklist of things that you go down when you begin to try to assess what's happening for that person and what your response is there. When you walk into that situation, in a missional situation, you begin to ask that question of, what does this person need and how am I going to relate to this person in a way that's going to win them to the Lord maybe, or whatever the objective might be in that moment. There are ways of thinking about that are different from my ways of thinking about things, because I'm a historian, right? So I think about what's the context and how are people behaving in that context, in the past. That's just the way I think inside my academic discipline. That's the structure of it. We also have particular values, economic values perhaps, or physical health values, or getting things done through technology values. Okay, that structure, the kinds of things that we hold to be important, that focus our attention on particular matters inside of academics. Likewise, inside of our spiritual disciplines, we have particular ways of thinking. We have particular values, particular practices, different methods of discovery and the like. How can we merge those two things together becomes an important question for us. And to do so intentionally, as opposed to just living what a friend of mine calls the thrown life. Okay, the life where you throw the dice and whatever comes up, well, that's just what it is. Right?
That's what I thought.
What?
No, it's a dice thing.
Yeah.
So, exercises, I call this. Okay, exercises in faith learning integration. So, exercise number 1, I'm going to give you 3 of these, or I'm going to introduce 3 of these to you that I've come up with. Okay, exercise number 1 is contemplative journaling. Okay, this is something that you can do by yourself. This is what you use maybe your quiet time for, and many of you probably already practice something like this. Okay, contemplative journaling, in which you say, here's the scripture. Here's the scripture, particularly the Gospels. Here's Jesus going and doing things. Okay, if I'm going to be Christ-like, and I read this gospel passage about Jesus behaving in a particular way, treating people in particular ways, being offended by people in particular ways, what's that mean for what it means to be Christ-like? Ignatius Loyola, in the 16th century, developed wrote a little book called Spiritual Exercise. Yes, I think so. Spiritual Exercises, in which he had a contemplative practice where he said, read a gospel passage and put yourself into it. I think he called it the application of the senses, where you put yourself into it and you smell what the smells were in that setting. You hear what was going on in that situation. You feel the wind blowing off the sea as Jesus is in the boat. You hear the seagulls, whatever it might be. You really put yourself into it as a way of increasing one's empathy to the situation. So once you're in it, then you can begin putting yourself into different roles in the story. What would it have been like to be a Pharisee hearing this message? What would it have been like to be the woman caught in adultery, to be experiencing what she was experiencing in that parable or in that story? Okay, what would it have been like to be Jesus, experiencing these people acting out in these various ways, and how did he respond, and what must have been going on in his mind to get him to respond or to provoke that kind of response? And then write about it. And then ask yourself, And who am I in this story? How can I be more like Christ given what has occurred to me as I've thought about and contemplated this particular event recorded in Scripture? Okay, so contemplative journaling is one of these exercises, okay, that I would encourage you to consider taking up. And not a forever thing, right? Just a little bit. Okay, just take it up for a couple of weeks. Read through the Gospels, pull out some of those passages, and think about it and write about it. Okay, exercise 1. Exercise 2. It's a value gap analysis. Remember, we're minding the gap. How do you know what your values are, really? Okay.
I'm serious.
Yeah, right. What are you spending your money on, right? That tells you something about your values. What are you spending your time on? Yeah, what are you spending your time on? That tells you something about your values.
Emotional energy.
Mm-hmm. What makes you go up versus what weighs you down. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other ways you discern your values? Okay. What do you do? How do you act? I have a friend who says that one of the best ways to discover what your values are is to trip over them when you find yourself highly offended.
Yeah.
Trip over your values when you're highly offended by something. So think about for just a moment, what was the last thing that you were really offended by? What really offended you? Now, reflect on that just a minute and ask yourself, so what value was being trampled on that action by another person or whatever it was created such an emotional response in me? What was that value?
Is that a rhetorical question?
Well, I'll open it if you want to talk.
No, it's awfully disclosed.
Because values are really heartfelt, intimate things, aren't they? Yeah.
I had a friend who asked me last weekend to go look at a horse with her for her. She's considering buying it. And she also had a male friend come along. And so I assessed it one way and gave her an opinion, and he said it would eat too much, and I call it mansplain why she shouldn't get this particular horse. And it just went all over me, and what I think it shows me is that I really value my independence and my ability to be, I don't want somebody telling me what to do. I value my independence more than that. And then my feminist side came out, and I don't want a man telling me what I should do. I mean, it's amazing I'm single for all these years. But I did have to think about, why am I so ticked off at him and her? And it's because, stand up, woman, do what you want to do. Don't let somebody tell you what to do just because he did. I mean, yeah.
Okay, good. So you value independence?
I do. Probably to my own detriment, yeah.
And notice, Sheila was able to take what offended me, and now what values are underlying that? Anybody else want to share?
I'm offended that Sheila said mansplain.
One of my favorites. I wrap in the fact that I know I have some feminism issues. I've been living in the English department for 2 years. I couldn't help it. It's just rubbing off.
Yeah. Gwen's on the other end of the line saying, what?
Well, the wind probably is the least, but not totally, don't worry.
Okay, so we can find our own values that way. We can watch other people, and we can see when they're offended, and we can begin to probe what they might value, therefore, okay? And maybe I'm not going to say and maybe, and therefore, we can also, in our reading of the scriptures, in our reading of the life of Jesus, we can observe when Jesus was deeply offended by people's behavior. And we can discern from that some of Jesus's core values. And then we can take those core values of Jesus, compare them to what our values are, and maybe ask ourselves, if I'm going to be Christ-like, how do I adopt or align myself with some of these values that underlie the thinking and behavior of Jesus as it is manifested in our understanding of him in the scriptures? Okay, so that's an exercise. Okay, that something to kind of think about, something to kind of get your life into. Yes, ma'am.
Gwen has a question.
Okay.
Why do I think she's a feminist?
Some perspectives on these issues are hard for me to share with students because they are based on accumulated experience that they don't yet have.
Yeah,
Any suggestions on how to capitalize on this in a way that would make sense for them?
Well, I almost think maybe that getting them to do the exercise is part of it, right? I mean, they've got to come to their own sort of sense of things. I think several years ago, when we were revising the general education program, one of the things that we did was we made the first class in the sequence, Christian Faith and Life, because we recognized that a number of the students who came in didn't really understand what Christian faith or life looked like. We started them off with the Bible, and many of them hadn't really ever read the Bible, and probably even fewer of them now have actually sat down and read the Bible. And so we thought we needed really an even more sort of basic introduction to help them sort of begin to grapple with some of those kinds of questions. But grappling with the questions is where it comes from. So what if, I would say, students did a reading of a gospel passage, and maybe instead of, maybe that's your devotional one day, right? Reading of a gospel passage, and the question is, what offends Jesus here? What does Jesus value? Do you value that? How does that apply? Those kinds of short, brief, that's a 3-minute exercise possibly. Maybe that's the way to get at it. So we're not I'm looking at Khadija that she's going. So we're not telling our students. We're actually facilitating our students coming to their own conclusions, which is really a promotion of critical thinking, right? It's a promotion of problem solving for them personally.
Something that I've done too is ask a question to the class in talking about values, like, how many of you would say you value life? All of them raise their hand. If they don't, I'm a little worried, but they'll raise their hand, and then I say, well, how many of you have also texted and driven down the road?
Right.
And then just kind of let that sink in for a minute and say, well, how are you living out that value? Or is it really important to you if you say you value it, but at the same time, you're not practicing that?
Right.
So,
what do you value more if you're
Right.
driving down the road?
Right.
Right? Yeah, what's the higher value?
Well, and I think one of the things that I hear in Lynn's question is this idea that I think that because we're old in season, and that's the only way I can think of, we have so much more life experience than a 19 to 20-year-old, that it's easy to undervalue the experience they do bring to the table. We want them to reflect and think like we do sometimes, and to be able to see things that are so clear to us. And for them to be able to do some of these things, they're not going to come to the same place that I'm going to come to, hopefully. There's something wrong with me if they do, probably, because I haven't examined myself enough. But they do come to a place, and it's the practicing of coming to whatever place that is that then allows them to go to the next level. And it's just, we were all 19 once, and we knew everything, and it's a process, and hopefully you continue to go through that. And I think that that's one of the critical components I hear in that question is I can't expect them to bring to the table what an older person, a 30-plus-year-old person brings to the table, but to be accepting of exactly where they are.
Yeah, that's good. That's
I think there's also, playing with that too, there's also this different, they have such different definitions of what we would think of as moral absolutes. You know, truth is a very different thing, I think, to our students than what I grew up thinking. You know, there's this absolute truth and this is unchanging, but that's not really their reality.
Well, I think that comes with age as well.
Right, I do too, and a faith journey too, that is different maybe than, I mean, obviously than what they've experienced, because, you know, I'm at least twice as many years along as them, you know?
At least.
Yeah. At least. So I think that's like, how do we help them to even how do we even get to the point where in this kind of discussion, we're talking about the same things? Or do we just decide we're gonna be okay if we're not talking about the same things?
So I think also what I found as I had these ethical conversations really is where it comes up in my classes. How do we get to these ethical solutions, and why is your ethical decision different than mine? So we start with talking, just open-ended talking. What is truth? And it seems like a really simple question until we actually talk about it, right? And then we probe further into that, sort of what Kim was talking about. What is absolute truth? Is there absolute truth? And as the instructor, I'm not answering those questions. I'm just asking those questions and allowing the students to converse with one another, go back and forth with one another. And then they kind of have to do the journaling thing where they do an assignment where I just say, I just want you to write 300 words on what truth is to you. What does that mean? So in that way, they're intentionally struggling with it. And so we go from truth to then what do you value? What are the things that you say you value and why? And then we go from there, we say, okay, now take all of those things and here's this ethical framework. And just use the framework. You're going to come up with different solutions, but I just want to make sure you know the steps in the framework. So I don't really care where you get, I just care how you get there.
And that going through the steps, right, the process is really important, because our lifelong experiences change the kind of change the texture of the solution. But if the process is good, God can continue to use that process to work out His perspective and truth in our lives, I think. Okay, exercise 3. This is where we go from the intellectual game to the practice game. Okay, exercise 3, the daily examine. Okay. My friend John King developed this as something called the daily boxes, and Stephanie Case and I have been using this, a version of this, in her MAEL classes for a couple of years now. So this is just an example here, but the idea behind this daily examiner, these daily boxes, is you have a set of categories, and I've done a real simple one here. And the categories are humility, integrity, and service. Okay? Each evening, just before you go to bed, you rate yourself on humility, integrity, and service on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 being not good, 5 being great. Okay, so how humble was I today? 1 to 5. How much integrity did I have today? 1 to 5. How much service did I do today? How did I serve others today? 1 to 5. And you don't judge yourself so much on that, you just kind of rate yourself. And then tomorrow you do the same thing, and then the next day you do the same thing. And you just kind of keep doing this. You do it over time. And after a couple of weeks, you sit down and tally your results. Okay, tally them. And just kind of see what it looks like. Okay. Here's the interesting thing about this exercise. If you don't, you're not putting in any interventions, okay? You're just rating. What's interesting is, after 2 weeks, you begin to notice that your rating goes up in each one of those categories. Okay, so you're just paying a little bit of attention to it, just a little bit of attention to each one of those categories. How humble am I? You just ask yourself that question every night, and just put a score down and you can go to sleep.
I can already see that. When I'm at work,
Uh-huh.
I would score myself much higher
Uh-huh.
than whenever I'm not.
Right, right. Uh-huh. That's an interesting observation. That's good. That's a simple one. Here's a slightly more complex one. Okay, more categories. Okay, this one is called the SERVE examen. Okay, you score yourself on what? Selflessness. How enterprising are you? How enterprising have you been? I get that notion of enterprising in terms of discipleship. From when we see, the parable of the servants who receive variable numbers of talents, and then they do things with them. And what does the master say? Well, the ones who actually were enterprising and did something with them, productive, were the ones that were most approved. Okay, so maybe to be a good servant of the Lord, we're expected to be enterprising in some way or another with our lives. Respectful, vital, life-giving. How life-giving are we? How alive are we? And how empathetic are we? On sort of a daily basis, just kind of in the living of life. I think that if you do this for 2 or 3 weeks, it changes you. And it tends to change you along the lines of these categories. Okay, and that's just out of practicing a simple self-evaluation. Okay. Of course, you recognize that this is just a simple tool, right? You can put any category in the box. Okay, these are just some categories for us. I thought of, what if the acronym here was servant? Okay, you get something like that, and all of a sudden you get too many categories. Okay, so you've got to keep it kind of simple. Usually 3 to 5 categories is all you really want in this particular tool, because the more there are, the less likely you are to actually sit down at night and score yourself. Okay, so it's got to stay somewhat simple. But I thought of, what would it look like in servant if it was like authenticity for the A, right? How authentic am I being? Okay, or if I had a T in there, how trustworthy am I? Okay, things like that, to just sort of recognize that there's improvement that I can make. And if I evaluate myself and recognize that there's a gap between where I imagine I should be and where I am, that kind of improvement will come along just by paying a little attention to it from time to time. Okay, final thing. So what does it mean to live in a disciplined community? Because that's the kind of community we're talking about in this Christ-centered community that we live in, so we're disciplined. Okay, we have these academic disciplines, but we also have this spiritual discipline that we're developing, trying to walk in. One of the characteristics, I think, of living in a disciplined community is that we're prepared to be in community with one another. So we're willing to do things like make promises to one another about how we're going to live, or what our intentions are in terms of our conduct with one another. We're willing to set a price on that behavior. Okay, either a price of reward or a price of consequence, and we're willing to partner with one another to be held accountable by one another for the promises that we make to each other. Okay, that's a kind of preparation to live a disciplined life inside of a disciplined community. And then we practice. And then we do stuff. Here's the funny thing. When I started taking karate, I was terrible at those katas when I started. I intended to do those katas really well. I saw my teacher do those katas really fabulously. He could do them quickly, and he could do them fluidly, and it seemed almost like he did it effortlessly. And every time I tried, it was like a real thinking experience, trying to remember exactly how that went, where that foot was supposed to go, how that hand was supposed to move. It was just it was ugly. And it was ugly for a long time. But over time, it improved with practice. So does saying that we promise to be a certain way mean that we are a certain way? No, it just means we promise it, right? And we won't ever get there unless we partner with our colleagues, right? To hold us accountable to continue to practice. We also have to publish the results. What does that mean? Well, go ahead,
You
Karen.
couldn't get past an hour without talking about assessments.
You're right. That's right. That's right. I talked about assessment in the earlier slide too. We've got to publish the results. What does that mean? Well, that means that we've got to share not only our successes, but we've got to share our failures with each other. Sunshine's a wonderful thing, right? So when we're failing, we need to shine some light on that and not hide it. Hiding failure leads to vice along the way. So we've got to have a community where we can share our successes and our failures. And as we do that, we can develop an opportunity to polish the rough edges off of our lives and to further integrate the sort of notion of here is Christ, here am I. How do I close that gap? How do I close that gap between the way I think and the way Christ thinks? How do I close that gap between how I behave, whether it's consistent with my discipline or not, and the way Christ would have me behave? How do I bring those things together? Well, I bring those things together by living intentionally into this community. So there's an intellectual game to play. There's the, what are the practices of my discipline? What are the habits? What are the ways of thinking? And what are the practices and the disciplines of Christianity, and how do I think those things together? But there's also the practice of how do I live those things together? How am I a historian and a Christian at the same time? Maybe the real question becomes just, how am I a human and Christ-like at the same time? And how do we learn that together? And if we follow that, I would argue, if we follow that practice, faith and learning integration comes rather naturally. Because as teachers, we teach out of our lives. So.
I guess we do. Because whenever you were talking about polishing those rough edges, it was funny because because through my adult life, I have come to coin the term, when I go through something really hard, really humbling, and I finally get to the other side, I just have to share with people that, God just put me back in the rock tumbler, trying to smooth up those rough edges. Each one of those brought me to the side of being able to see Him more and to share more. I don't know, I just feel like that helps me to be more Christ-like. Every time I go through one, I have a good one.
Me neither.